In October 2023, in just his third competitive marathon ever, 23-year-old Kelvin Kiptum won the Chicago Marathon by running the fastest time ever recorded in an official race. Kiptum ran the entire distance in just 2 hours and 35 seconds, becoming the first person to run under the 2-hour 1-minute mark in a competition. In a sport where records are usually broken by incredibly slim margins, Kiptum beat the time set by Eliud Kipchoge, widely regarded as the greatest marathon runner ever, by 34 seconds. It was one of the most impressive athletic performances that we've ever seen, but as genuinely absurd as some of the numbers on this run were, Kiptum's age and some important technological advancements in the sport mean that there are probably more performances like it coming. And there's one record in particular that may be in danger sooner rather than later. In a lot of ways, the quest for a sub-2-hour marathon feels like the 21st century version of the race to put a man on the moon. In 1991, Dr. Michael Joyner published a paper modeling the optimal conditions for a marathon runner, and hypothesized that under the perfect circumstances, both biological and environmental, the distance could be run in just under 1 hour and 58 minutes. Now, at the time, the record marathon pace was nearly 9 minutes faster than that, but over time, runners got way faster, and the record got way closer. In 2016, Nike announced Breaking 2, a 6-month-long project that would cost tens of millions of dollars to put together, all for one singular purpose: running a sub-2-hour marathon. They threw absolutely everything at this thing. They found the perfect track, analyzed the perfect drafting and pacing patterns, recruited the perfect runners, and created the perfect shoe to try and break the record in. Eliud Kipchoge ended up running the marathon in 2 hours and 25 seconds, missing their goal by less than a second per mile. But 2 years later, Kipchoge became the first man to run 26.2 miles in less than 2 hours. It wouldn't be an official record because he had things like a literal laser plotting the optimal path for him to run, but it was still a sub-2-hour marathon, and if nothing else, it proved that under the right conditions, it could be done. But was this the marathon's Roger Bannister moment? Or was it just a science experiment that couldn't be replicated in a real race? Performances like Kelvin Kiptum's in 2023 suggest that it may be the former, but Kiptum ran an entire marathon at a 4:36 mile pace, including the fastest mile in marathon history at 4:18, and was still more than half a minute away from breaking 2 hours. Someone's gonna have to go faster, maybe even a lot faster to break that barrier. But how the heck is that gonna happen? To answer that, I sought out the expertise of a couple of people who have spent a lot more time thinking about this stuff than I have. The first of those was Alex Hutchinson, a journalist and former Canadian national team runner whose book, Endure, is a comprehensive and informative look at the science and history of endurance. From brain training to nutrition to the physiology of effort, Hutchinson uses dozens of studies to break down every element of an endurance athlete's quest to go faster, longer, and he has a lot to say about what it would take to run a sub-2-hour marathon. It's an absolute must-read if you're at all interested in sports psychology or exercise science, which seems kind of likely since you're here, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who thinks that about this book or the ideas in it. Because I also reached out to Dr. Beau, a sports chiropractor, physician, and author of The Age of Movement. Beau doesn't just talk the talk, he also walks the walk, or runs the run, I guess in this case. He's currently training for a 160-mile ultramarathon, which, as you might imagine, requires some pretty intensive and specific workouts to prepare for. But as both an athlete and a clinician, Beau sees that specificity, especially when it comes to that person's individual body chemistry, as an incredibly important part of getting the most out of them.
It's a little bit different for each athlete because of the physiology, right? Me coming from a sprint heavy background, I tend to have a better lactate recovery. Well, I should maximize that, right? So in trail running, that plays to my advantage. You get somebody else that, can shuttle other, things physiologically better than I can. They're going to be able to run, a 2-hour marathon and sustain a harder effort for a longer period of time rather than these ups and downs. But all of those are obviously different races, which require different strategies, but then different athletes within the same race will have different strategies based on mental capacity, attitude, physiology. But I would say the biggest one there is literally the mental aspect.
We'll circle back around to the mental aspect in a bit, but for now, I want to hone in on the physiology part. In that same paper from 1991, Michael Joyner identified 3 key physical markers that could make the difference in running a sub-2-hour marathon: maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy, or how efficient a runner is. And if you think about an endurance athlete like a kind of human sports car, all of that makes sense. These 3 metrics identify how big that runner's engine is, what kind of intensity they can keep that engine running at before redlining, and how efficient their mechanics are in using all that power. These metrics aren't perfect, and pretty frustratingly, no single one of them could be identified as the biggest predictor of performance, but in theory, if the right person had the right mix of all three of these things, they could run a sub 2-hour marathon. But if we know all of that, and have known it for over 30 years, then why hasn't anyone been able to run Joyner's theorized time? We have the data that could theoretically get us there, so why haven't we been able to kind of reverse engineer the perfect marathon runner? I think the answer to that is pretty simple. These aren't actually cars or engines that we're talking about here. They're people.
Nothing's new has come out of running data in the last 50 years. It's just how you use the data, right? We see the same stuff over and over, and they're like, okay, what do we do with that? What's that mean? But what do you find the best coach in the world doing? They're doing what works because it works. And I think that's, what we're finding overall is that, you'd vary somebody's pace without having the physiologic lactate test or whatever on the back end. It's just that's what works.
What works is going to vary almost completely from person to person. And I think that's kind of the point. In order to go fast enough to run a competitive marathon in under 2 hours, someone is going to have to make absolutely everything work in their favor for basically the entire race. But on that point, and just to get this out of the way, there's one factor that has definitely given modern runners a boost no matter who they are, and that's what they're putting on their feet. In 2017, Nike introduced the Vaporfly 4%, a shoe with a special foam midsole with a carbon fiber plate in the middle that was so effective at improving running economy that it was nearly banned from the 2020 Olympics. Now, do they actually help that much? I don't know. I'm not really the right person to ask that, but I will say that regardless of how much the shoes are actually improving the runners mechanically, they are helping them run faster, and that's important.
We're seeing technology change the sport. Literally, everybody said, if you're not wearing plated shoes, you ain't gonna be in the top 5, right? So it's just, everybody's doing it. So that's the platform has changed. So we should see, things change in terms of times and records.
The people setting those records are going to be the ones who can make that technology work for them. And that's true regardless of which sport we're talking about. And to further that point, I want to go back to something else that Beau mentioned, and that's pacing. There are a bunch of videos out there showing how fast Eliud Kipchoge was actually running in his world record marathon, and how difficult that pace is for a normie to try and keep up with. Generally speaking, the only pace that someone trying to run a sub 2-hour marathon really needs to worry about is fast. Really fast. About 4 minutes and 34 seconds per mile to be exact, for 26.2 consecutive miles. But just because they're running fast the entire time, doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be running steady. Speaking very generally, most endurance athletes pace their races on a kind of shallow U-curve. They start out strong when energy's at its highest, slow down in the middle as they settle in, and then pick up at the end when the finish line is in sight. A lot of elite runners, both in the marathon and otherwise, tend to do something slightly different. They start strong and then basically just try and slow down slower than everyone else. You can see that pattern, also known as a reverse J-curve or a positive split, in Kipchoge's world record marathon in Berlin in 2022. But when Kelvin Kiptum ran the record marathon in 2023, he didn't do either of those things. Instead, he ran what's known as a negative split, which means as the race went on, he somehow got faster. Right around the 30-kilometer mark of the race, Kiptum absolutely stomped on the gas, running his next 5K in 13 minutes and 51 seconds. Just for some perspective, that time would have been good enough to make the final at the US Olympic trials in 2021. But here this guy was, running it in kilometer 30 of one of the biggest marathons in the world. How a runner does in a race depends largely on how they feel they're doing, and that's not absolute, it's relative. You could have two runners with the same VO2 max and lactate threshold running at the exact same pace, but for whatever reason, it could feel a lot harder or easier for one of them than the other, leading to real physiological effects like a higher heart rate and greater levels of stress. To run the absolute perfect race, a runner would have to know their body and brain well enough to account for what they need at any given moment, and that might mean getting a little creative. If asked about what kind of pace would be best for a marathon, I think most non-runners would say that a steady one would be best. And on a macro scale, that's exactly what elite marathoners do. In their record runs, Kiptum and Kipchoge kept about 30 seconds between their fastest 5K and their slowest. But if you look at Kiptum's run specifically, you can see that he deviates from that trend line pretty significantly, especially as the race goes on. And according to a paper from the University of Paris-Saclay in 2022, that actually might be better. The best runners shift between energy systems, from aerobic to anaerobic, as the race goes on and the conditions change, in order to maximize their performance. And as Beau told me, that's not the only thing they can change as they continue to run.
It was found Western States 100, which is the oldest 100-mile race in the U.S. and one of the biggest races in the world. They did gait analysis where they were wearing foot pods on all the elites, and they found out that the elites basically went through gait switching. What I mean by gait switching is they would change stride length or their pace overall. They would slow down, they would speed up. And this wasn't kind of a coach thing. And you'd say, well, that's just the terrain, right? If they're going up a big hill, they're going to slow down. If they're going downhill, they speed up. That's not what they found, right? It was independent of the terrain. So it wasn't dependent of the terrain. And what they realized is this is a sparing strategy, right? So you don't use the same set of muscles ad nauseum, but at the same time, you're also task switching between, you have 3 different energy systems if we just kind of broke them into these big blocks. And they found out these people were doing this naturally. So then what happens? The data gets extrapolated. Coaches start coaching athletes to vary their pace and these things. And then that is the norm now. Like, we know that's what you're supposed to do to kind of hopefully not break yourself by running at that sustained pace.
Long story short, if anyone's going to do this in an official race, whether it's Kiptum or somebody else, they're going to have an awful lot dialed in and customized to a pretty extreme extent. They're going to know the best shoes for them to wear, the correct pace for them to run, and how much they want that pace to vary, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. That's the stuff they can control, both physiologically and psychologically, but there's also a lot more other stuff that they can't control, and that opens up an entirely different can of worms.
Somebody can have a day, and I hate to be that kind of, laissez-faire with an answer, but it's, you put all the factors together. I mean, you got to think about the factors with an event like a marathon from where the race is in the world, right? Like, if you have a race on the equator versus 1 or 2 degrees off of the equator, that changes a whole heck of a lot in terms of humidity and all these things, the temperature at the time. Literally the person's physiology that day, mental attitude that day, if 6 or 7 variables come together and it's just, that's the day, why not?
It does seem a little reductive to boil the decades-long search for a sub-2-hour marathon down to what's essentially just the stars aligning, but I think Beau's right. Even under the best of circumstances, we're basically just loading everything we can into a program, running a simulation, and hoping for the best. An athlete could train perfectly for the perfect race, but if they don't sleep well the night before because they're nervous, or if the event itself gets them even slightly outside of their normal routine, that can have compounding physical effects over the course of a 2-hour-long race. There are things that can affect the performance of athletes that we're not able to control, and we never will be. But in the mind of the right athlete, that could be just as much a positive as it is a negative. One of the ideas discussed in Endure is the theory of anticipatory regulation, a term created by South African physiologist Tim Noakes that refers to the brain restricting the amount of muscle activation a person experiences during exercise in order to prevent any potential severe or longer-term damage. The way that Noakes puts it, there's a reason that the overwhelming majority of these ultra-endurance athletes can do what they do without dying at the end of it. According to his theory, our brains have a kind of dimmer for nervous signaling that prevents us from pushing too far. And make no mistake about it, running a 2-hour marathon is going to require pushing about as far as the human body can go. But what if we could control that dimmer a little bit better? A lot of research shows that we might be able to, but only if we understand how our brains actually work, which is very rarely in isolation.
We know that it's not any one part of a human's brain that does any one thing, right? Even when we localize sensations like hearing or taste, we know that you can have a synesthesia effect where you use other parts of your brain when you lose sensations. So it's not like we can localize function. So that's what makes this stuff hard to study. But when you see simple studies like when somebody is running and they either pass by somebody that's smiling or make themselves smile, and they will literally run faster and feel better, that's not physiologic, right? That's psycho-emotional. And then if we say, well, there's 3 legs that a human stands on, right, in that biopsychosocial model, it makes sense. Now we can call it whatever we want, the belief effect, the central governor theory. You got to learn to harness that stuff because these are real things, and you can either weaponize them against yourself or you can leverage them for your benefit.
So after all of this theoretical discussion of the physical and mental requirements for running a sub 2 hour marathon, here's my very practical question. Can Kiptum actually do this? Well, there are certainly some encouraging signs. First, let's look at that record. He ran a marathon in 2 hours and 35 seconds, breaking the previous record by 34 seconds. If he does that again, well, let's just say he won't be able to get much closer after that. But there's also his age. Kiptum is 23, nearly 15 years younger than Kipchoge was when he set the record in 2022. He's obviously got the physical gifts. If he can continue to improve himself physically and mentally over the next decade or so, he's going to get plenty of opportunities to run sub 2. If he stays healthy, that is, which I think everyone should just start praying to the gods of running about right this second. If he or someone else does break the record, though, expect that person to not be the last. Expectations play a powerful role in how we conceptualize what's possible. So once that psychological glass ceiling breaks, there's a good chance that those predetermined limits will go along with it.
People see something happen, right? I mean, think of Ryan Krauser. You get this beast that's just launching shot puts out there that are just destroying records. And you're like, that guy's an outlier. I guarantee you, in the next year to 3 years, there'll be a bunch of Ryan Krausers. There's going to be a bunch of guys throwing shot puts, and then you're like, well, wait a minute, how'd that happen? The mental restrictor plates are the unknown land, right? That's the book Endure. That's what that's exploring, is like, some people are better at taking that restrictor plate off than others. And then you give them all the other factors. There you go.
After looking into this for the last several weeks, for my money, I think that the 2 hour marathon record in an official race is in serious danger. I've heard so many stories of how the human body and mind can push past old boundaries to do something that's never been done before, whether it's climbing Mount Everest or riding a bike further than anyone in human history over the course of an hour. Combine that with all of the advancements we've made in technology and the ability to get real, actionable data out of our bodies in real time, and there's really no reason left why this shouldn't be possible. We've got the athletes, we've got the physical and psychological understanding of what they need to succeed, and now we have some real-life examples of how close we can get if everything comes together. It's quite literally just a matter of time now. And if that time gets about 36 seconds shorter, then we as a human species will have crossed another seemingly impossible accomplishment off of our collective list. Hi everyone, I'm Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about anything and everything related to sports psychology and culture. Today, that was running, and since this is the first time we've talked about that on the show, I can only assume that at least some of you are new here, in which case, welcome. If you liked what you saw, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. If you've been here a while, please do try and be nice and not scare off our new friends. This is a community for all, and I cherish it more than a pretty significant chunk of my family members. So on that note, I've got to make like Eliud Kipchoge and run so I can start in the next video. Hope to see you back again soon. Bye.